When I tell you about it, many people refuse to believe it. But if you were in my position, you would never forget what happened. This is a story about how a trivial mistake in human greed can turn into a real hell. I have always been an avid car enthusiast, fond of vintage cars. My hobby became a real passion, and this hobby led me to buy a rare copy, 1969, for restoration. Its previous owner, as it turned out, was a collector, and before selling the car, he disappeared. I didn't know him, but everything was fine, or so I thought. The car was in the garage, which I turned into a workshop. After I decided to restore it, I found that there was a box with documents and various small things in the trunk. Inside the box, I found an old film sealed in a plastic container. My interest in this subject was my first suspicion. I checked the date on the tape, 1981. I thought it was just an old home video, but I soon realized that it was something more. That evening, when I first started the old projector, I did not expect to see what I saw. First shots showed an ordinary day. The family was having lunch in the house, the children were playing, and everything seemed normal. But after a few minutes, the plot began to change. The picture became more and more distorted, and the sounds were strange and unclear. At some point, a man appeared on the screen. It was the same previous owner of the car, sitting at the table with empty eyes. His face was distorted by a grimace of fear, and the camera was getting closer to him. Ever since I saw this footage, I've been feeling strange things. My work on the car has become obsessive. I worked myself to exhaustion, striving to complete the recovery as quickly as possible. I felt like something was watching me, but every time I tried to figure it out, I couldn't find anything. My nightmares began to overshadow reality, and I began to be in a state of constant stress. One night, when I was working on the car, I noticed that the garage had become too quiet. Suddenly, I heard a rustle coming from the trunk of the car. Opening it, I saw that all the documents and small things that I put back were gone. In their place was a new piece of paper, on which was written only one word: help. I remember sitting in front of this piece of paper with trembling hands, feeling cold sweat trickle down the back of my neck. Help me. Black letters seemed to burn out my eyes. I tried to calm myself down, convincing myself that this was someone's bad prank. But as soon as I closed the trunk, I heard something like a screech of metal, as if something was moving under the car. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed listening to every sound, every rustle outside, trying to convince myself that it was all the result of fatigue and stress. But when at 3 a.m. I heard a knock on the window, my nerves gave out. I jumped up, went to the window, and of course, there was no one there. Just a slight rustle of the wind on the leaves outside. The next morning, I called my friend Dan. We've known each other since high school, and he's always been the guy who could solve any problems. I told him about the car and the strange events that took place around it. He laughed at me, of course, promised to come and help me figure it out. By evening, he was in my garage. "Well, where's that damn car of yours?" he asked with a grin, walking up to the car. I showed him the box with the documents and the film, told him about all the oddities, about the note and the noise. Dan began to inspect the car, looking into every corner. Found nothing. "Look, dude, it's just a coincidence. You haven't slept properly for 3 nights. And about the note, maybe you wrote it yourself without noticing? Or did one of the neighbors decide to play a prank?" His words sounded logical, but it didn't help me get rid of my paranoia. That evening, we decided to watch the film again. This time, Dan insisted that we record it digitally so that we could see the details better. I reluctantly agreed, and we put it on the record, but after a minute of playback, the recording stopped. The screen was filled with white noise and interference, as if the film itself had broken. "This is already weird," Dan muttered, trying to restore the footage. But instead of returning the image, the screen flickered for a moment, and then something new appeared. Black screen with one inscription: "You'll regret it." We both jumped away from the monitor. The seconds dragged by as we stared at these words in silence, as if we couldn't believe what we were seeing. Suddenly, the garage light went out. Total darkness. My heart was beating so hard that I felt a throbbing in my temples. The old man was standing in the doorway. His eyes were looking at me, but it seemed that he was seeing something beyond the present moment. His gaze was glassy, as if something had been weighing on him for years. The silence was unbearable, and it felt like time had stopped. "I'm looking for information about a car I bought from a collector," I began, not knowing how to formulate the question better. "You owned this house, didn't you? Do you know anything about the previous owner?" His eyes flashed with alarm, and for a moment I thought he was going to slam the door. However, instead, he took a deep breath and motioned for me to enter. The house was even darker inside than it was outside. The smell of dust and dampness hit my nose, and the walls were covered with old wallpaper, which smelled of abandonment. The old man moved with difficulty. His every step was accompanied by the soft creaking of the wooden floor. "You shouldn't have touched the car," he finally said when we sat down at the table in the dark, half-empty kitchen. His voice sounded tired, as if he had repeated this phrase more than once. Everyone who tried to intervene suffered. You think you're in control of your life, but that's just an illusion. My hands were sweating, and I clenched them into fists under the table. The feeling grew stronger in my head that I was in a situation that could not be resolved just like that. The old man spoke further. His words were chaotic, as if he couldn't concentrate on one memory. "This car belonged to my brother. He was fixated on her. At first it was just a dream of restoration, but then something changed. He started talking about there being something inside the car. More. He became withdrawn, aggressive, and began to avoid anyone who tried to help him. I felt a chill run down my spine. The old man's story was reminiscent of what happened to me. Every day I spent in the garage, I felt the car pulling me towards it. The desire to restore it became overwhelming, overshadowed everything else. But I never thought of it as something sinister. One night, the old man continued, he disappeared. I tried to find him, but the only thing I found was this damn car. She was standing in the woods, in the middle of nothing, locked up like she was waiting for the next fool. Silence filled the room. I could feel the air getting heavier by the second. I wanted to ask questions, but fear and anxiety stuck in my throat, preventing me from saying a word. The car won't let you go. The old man looked straight into my eyes for the first time since I entered his house. You should know that the further you go, the more you lose yourself. You'll think you can control the situation. That's cheating. With that, he got up and walked to the door, gesturing for me to leave. The conversation was over. I didn't know whether to believe him or not, but one thing was clear. The old man knew something, and his warning sounded too real. When I went outside, one thought was spinning in my head. Something is wrong with this car. And now, I had no choice but to deal with it to the end. Returning to the garage, I noticed that the two black SUVs that had been following me earlier were again nearby. The headlights shone with a cold light aimed directly at my car. These people clearly knew something, or at least wanted to know. When I entered the garage, I froze in place for a moment. Inside, everything was not as I had left it. The floor was covered with new scratches, and the tools that I had carefully laid out were scattered all over the room again. The car stood in the center, its body gleaming in the light of a weak lamp, as if it was mocking me. I walked over to her, trying to keep my hands from shaking. My head was spinning with fatigue and tension. The trunk was slightly ajar, and inside I saw the same box with the documents again. But something was different. It took me a moment to figure out what it was, but then I noticed. There was a small black object lying among the papers. I picked it up and realized that it was a cassette. There were no marks on it, just dirty fingerprint. I found an old player and inserted a cassette. The grinding of metal and a strange hoarse voice filled the room. The voice was barely audible, as if the speaker was behind a wall. I began to listen, trying to catch at least one word, and suddenly I heard, "You're next." I dropped the player on the floor and it shattered into pieces. My heart was pounding in my chest. Is this really the record left by the same person who owned the car before me? Or was it just another joke? But I knew one thing. There was no getting rid of this fear. Suddenly, the garage light flickered and went out. Again, I was standing in absolute darkness, surrounded by sounds that shouldn't have been there. There was a scraping, a rustling, and this barely audible knock, as if someone was outside and trying to get in. I quickly grabbed a flashlight, but its light seemed too weak to penetrate this strange darkness. It seemed that the darkness was alive. It enveloped me, squeezed my chest, and did not allow me to breathe. I rushed to the door, but as soon as I grabbed the handle, I heard a heavy thump from the other side. Fear paralyzed me, but I knew I had to move. As I ran outside, I felt the cold night air envelop me. The SUVs were gone, but somewhere in the distance I heard the sound of an engine approaching. I stood in the middle of an empty street, not knowing what to do next. A sense of doom engulfed me. This car, these people, everything that was happening seemed to be torn out of a nightmare. But it was reality.